Thank you for taking that moment with us to go ahead and just breathe together. Again, meditation and mindfulness is just a powerful tool to help us just regulate ourselves throughout the day, to pay attention to what's actually going on in our bodies and in our minds. So it's actually something that you can incorporate into your classroom, which is why I wanted to present that to you all today. All right, let's get into our welcome and why we're here today. So Brittany, who is the COO for the Institute for Anti-Racist Education, will go ahead and welcome. We have two Brittany's here today, so keep that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brittany Spatz. As Ashley said, I work at the Institute for Anti-Racist Education. We're so grateful for all of you for taking time out of your crazy day to join us to talk about this incredibly important topic. Ashley and I, as former teachers, we talk all the time about how teachers are sent into the field without any basic understanding of trauma, of how it impacts the brain, of how it impacts learning and behavior. And so we, as part of our mission, are working with teachers and school districts across the nation to really help shift the focus of all schools to one that's trauma-informed and restorative. And so this panel is just filled with brilliant thought leaders in this work, and we're so excited to have them here with us. We do have many new faces joining us tonight, and so I figured if anybody would like to enter where you're coming from in the chat, so we can also honor the land that you're on and also see just who else is out there. I know we had participants across the country and a few international folks signed up, so we'd love to hear from you. And then we do have the question and answer box open and available. We'll have some time at the end of our program for questions, so please feel free as things come up, jot them into the question and answer, and we'll try to get to as many of them today, and if not today, through our social media channels, hopefully this week. So I'm going to pass it back to this incredible panel. Thank you for being here. And if there's anything that you need to know about the Institute for Anti-Racist Education, you can find it on our Instagram or our website. And we'd love to continue the conversation with all of you.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. And I have the pleasure of introducing our panel. Let me tell you, these are some wonderful, wonderful women. I am so excited. I've met them personally in the past. We've worked together on a few things. We went to Brittany, the other Brittany, Taylor, and I, we all went to Harvard Divinity School together, and I met Troya through Brittany, and I am just so excited to have them here in conversation. So just to give you a little bit more about them and their backgrounds, Taylor Stewart is a counseling psychology doctorate student at Boston College in the School of Education and Human Development. Her research focuses on racial trauma and race-related stress, spiritual and religious coping, and psychological interventions for students of color at predominantly white institutions. She is a researcher for the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture. Taylor received her BA in psychology and a BA in English from Wellesley College. She received her MDiv from Harvard Divinity School, where she concentrated in spiritual care and counseling. She has worked as a chaplain and advisor for Black students, a personal development coach for high school students, and in college mental health counseling. Taylor has offered workshops on stress and anxiety management, spiritual wellness, and coping with racial trauma. She has also hosted events centered on race and culture for college students. We also have Brittany Foster, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Trajectory of Hope, LLC. She currently works at an all-boys parochial high school in Watts, California. In the past, she has worked as a counselor in both elementary and high school settings. In addition, she has experience working as a dean of students for an elementary school. And working as an administrator, Brittany worked directly with student discipline issues and directly saw the impact that it had on the whole school community while working with all parties involved, teachers, students, parents, and support staff. Brittany helped organize and implement restorative practices at the school as an alternative to suspension. Brittany has over the years collected stories and narratives from whole school communities surrounding discipline outcomes and its effects on both students and educators. With passion, Brittany has co-founded the organization Trajectory of Hope. She has also worked as an emergency response children's social worker for the Department of Children and Family Services in Los Angeles. Most recently, Brittany obtained her master's in divinity at Harvard Divinity School. She is interested in intersectionality of faith, social welfare, education, and entrepreneurship. Dr. Troya L. Ellis, EDD, is the Chief Operating Officer for Trajectory of Hope, LLC. She has worked in the field of education for over 10 years in urban communities with historically underserved students and families that are often voiceless. Troya started her work in Long Beach Unified School District and has since worked in Los Angeles Unified, Compton Unified, and Aspire Public Schools. Over the years, she has worked as a school psychologist, but operated as a special education leader working collaboratively with teens and families to assure everyone's voice is heard. She has supervised school psychologists, interns, and practicum students, and operated as a professional learning community facilitator. She has imparted her experience with families in school teams to students earning their master's and teaching credentials in special education, as well as students earning a master's in school counseling and school psychology as an adjunct professor. Most recently, she earned an EDD from the University of Southern California, USC, in educational leadership with a research focus on teacher engagement practices that reduce negative discipline outcomes for Black male students. And I thought it was important to share the mission of Trajectory of Hope, which is why we brought them here. So listen to this. Trajectory of Hope works from the inside out to demystify how the legacy of racism and injustice in America impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color. They work with educational agencies and organizations who serve African American Black children and their families to uncover implicit bias by facilitating space for critical reflection and dialogue, affinity groups, and healing circles. Trajectory of Hope empowers leaders and stakeholders to dismantle oppressive structures that uphold systemic racism in order to fuel institutional change. We are just so glad, we're so excited to have all of you here to be in a conversation with us. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so we can actually see all of you on the big screen. And so let's just get into this conversation. I know for a fact that 61% in recent studies, they've said that 61% of students experience some traumatic event before the age of 16. We also know that 1 out of 3 students in the classroom would have had some traumatic experience or response to something that they've lived through. I've also been having conversations about how trauma does not only impact students, but we also have adults, teachers who are in the classroom, administrators, and everyone else who have also had traumatic experiences that are in these spaces. And so I'm interested in understanding, first and foremost, we want to learn more into all of that. Let's learn more about you. What is your work? What brought you to that work? And how do you see your work having an impact on systemic injustice in education? We'll start with you, Taylor.
Sure. I just want to make sure I heard the question. So what brought me to this work and how it's impacting, I'm guessing, students and the well-being of people in this country. So for me, I study racial trauma, race-related stress, spiritual and religious coping. And I specifically study that in response, looking at how students of color, especially Black students, use spirituality, religion, and other coping strategies to cope with the racist experience that they may be experiencing either in their life, in their institutions and organizations. And I think that for me, when it comes to systemic issues that we're all dealing with, I think that for our communities, it's really important to provide resources that can help them be able to ground themselves. I feel like it's very easy to be in a state of dysregulation and hypoarousal when you're constantly bombarded with things that can be traumatic or have traumatic experiences in your life. And so for me, in my work, I seek to figure out ways that I can learn how to help individuals kind of ground themselves, cope with the things that they are dealing with, draw upon strengths and protective strategies that they do have in order for them to really be able to thrive, not just survive, not just barely make it through. And I feel like, honestly, that's what drove me to this work, my own life experiences, similar to the things that you were talking about, how teachers also have their own traumas that they're dealing with. I have my own traumas, and, I come from a Black family and a Black community, and a lot of the work that I'm doing was inspired by wishing that I had someone that I knew that was doing this work when I was growing up and coming of age. And so what I hope to do is equip many individuals with those necessary tools and resources.
Thank you for that. I think that is all important. It's a lot of things that we don't think about. And so I'm excited to hear more about what you're doing as we unpack this conversation. Brittany and Troia, I'd love to hear what brought you all to this work, especially with Trajectory of Hope, what it is that you do, and how you see your work making systemic changes in education.
So I'm a social worker, and all that I do is usually rooted from this space of focusing on the person and all the different systems, the ecological perspective, all the different systems that affect the youth, because youth is actually where I find most passion for. And what brought me just to social work is similar to Taylor. As a child, I remember not feeling comfortable or safe going over certain family members' homes. And my mom would always say, well, what's wrong? Why don't you want to go there? I was a kid. I didn't have the language to say, I don't feel safe. I just would get stomach aches, or I just wouldn't want to go, or I would want to get picked up before it was time to spend the night. And now as an adult, I realized that there were some situations and issues that were happening in those homes that no one was telling me, but why would I know? Like drug use was taking place and other things like that. And I could sense it as a 5-year-old, as a 7-year-old, as a 12-year-old. I just didn't have the language. And so I got into the field of social work because I wanted to help give language to young people and just to kind of help be advocates on their behalf. And that's what brought me to the field of social work. What brought me to the work of Trajectory of Hope was working in schools and realizing that I was a part of a bureaucratic system that is in desperate need of change and abolition. It needs to be abolished. We're currently in this state of what's going on with COVID, what's going on with the racial uprisings, what's happening across schools across this country and this world is just shedding light on what's already been happening. I'm grateful that I have the opportunity of being in the classroom, and I will be teaching distance learning starting next Monday. And Trajectory of Hope specifically, though, when Troy and I were working at Aspire, I was the dean of students for 2 years. And there was a 6-year-old boy who was maybe 3 other students were of African-American descent in the classroom. And he threw some beanbags at a girl that he probably had a crush on and his PE teacher. And we suspended him. He was 6. And I was a part of suspending a lot of African-American males, the representation of the student population. There was 10% African-American students, 90% Latino, Latinx students, and the majority of the students that we suspended were African-American males. And I was a part of the problem. And that's one of the reasons why I want to abolish what's currently, what the system of education needs to change. And Troy and I knew that we wanted to be a part of that change. And so we didn't want to just talk about it, we wanted to actually be about it.
Yes. So I think that I like to call myself an educator. I think that is the best way to kind of capture all the different ways in which I exist in education. Trained as a school psychologist, so definitely having a great connection to just the broad perspective that school psychologists bring to the work of education that oftentimes is missed because most folk don't even know what a school psychologist does, right? We don't have couches in our office. We typically have round tables and maybe we do have some games to play. But ultimately, I think that the position and the training that I received just mirrors who I am. And that is one who has passion around educating others and being a buffer to the experiences that students and people really just have in life. So I think I like to oftentimes think of myself in the role of a school psychologist where I was the go-between, right? Where teachers are the ones who had the students every day in their classrooms. And teachers are the ones who would come to me sometimes saying like, hey, how can I support this student? Or the student is struggling in this way, or I'm as a teacher struggling in this way. What do I do? How do I respond? Can you actually be with me while I talk to the parent? Because I'm not even sure how to engage the parent because I'm a little afraid of the parent because of the ways in which they've communicated with me in the past. So I like to see myself as a buffer, as a go-between. And in that, I learned a lot about teachers. Though I never was a classroom teacher myself, I learned that 99% of teachers come into the field with well-intention to serve students and to do the very best that they can to support them in being well-rounded students. However, even with their well-intention, they oftentimes miss the mark with certain students. And the certain students, as Brittany just described, were oftentimes our African-American students. More male in our experience than female, but there was definitely Black girls who oftentimes were also pushed off and pushed aside in lots of different ways. Yes. And what I recognized in my work was that the experiences that our Black students were having was trauma in the school. And it was something that I had not really put much attention to because it was oftentimes we think of trauma, we think of what's happening outside the school, right? We think about, you know, the home life. We think about the neighborhood students they're growing up in. We think about the gun violence. We think about the gangs. We think about all of those things, but we don't think about the fact that trauma is actually taking place in schools. And Trajectory of Hope was brought about because it was, again, as echoing what Brittany said, we wanted to be a part of the change. And even the name of our company was that we no longer wanted to support the trajectory of despair, because ultimately what we saw is that our Black students at the school we were at together, they were being deflated constantly, and teachers weren't intending to deflate them. This is all they knew to do, which was to send them out, which resulted in them maybe a suspension, and then sometimes to the extreme of even expulsions, because what they perceived to be an inappropriate behavior by this Black male student or this Black female student was something that warranted something in the discipline codes in California to say this is an expellable offense. And ultimately it was time to not only just be in the space to be a representation of, because we were few Blacks at that school, but it was about not just simply being a representation, but changing that trajectory. And how can we as two Black women who've done the work, who've done the studies, begin to do the work of shifting the trajectory to go upward where it's hope. And they're no longer seeing that I am the bad Black boy. I'm the one that all my other Latinx student peers are looking at me saying like, oh, he's bad. Oh yeah, he's the one you're coming into class to talk to because I know you're the school psych to come to help. So it was really, really rooted and grounded in the fact that how do we, Bettina Loves talks about this a lot in her book, like spirit murdering. How do we no longer cause the murdering of spirits and students and that trauma that we don't intend to? Again, I want to emphasize that because I don't believe anyone has ill will. We don't intend to do, but yet we do. And we felt like Trajectory of Hope as an entity away from school can come into schools and really support teachers to really elevate their awareness so that they can then begin to do the work that they really, really intend to do to support that trajectory of hope.
Kind of what you talked about, this idea that there's a trajectory that we can go in towards hope. And I can imagine, like you said, not everyone out there is ill intent in the work. I believe that being an educator in general is just mission-driven work, right? No one chooses to go into a field where you're like disrespected, honestly, as a career, right? Like you think about now with the NFL players choosing to say, I'm not going to work, and everyone praises that during COVID, but when teachers are like, I want to protect myself, then don't pay them if they're not going to want to come in, right? And so in this space, we understand that teachers are going to be in a unique position going back into the classroom, right? Distance learning is going to have an impact on what's about to happen for a lot of them, whether they're in the classroom or not. So for those who are here who want to be more informed about trauma, what is the one thing everyone should understand about what trauma actually is. So we say, you know, be trauma informed, but some on, you know, who are attending this webinar, this panel, may not fully understand, well, what is trauma? Everybody says, you know, when I was growing up, that was just you being too sensitive. Don't be so sensitive, right? You know, why are you crying all the time? It's not that big a deal, you know, especially as Black women, you gotta be strong. And so some teachers on here may not understand, or whoever's here with us may not fully understand what it is. So if you could just give us, what is trauma as a 101 definition, baseline, foundational start for us so that we all are on the same page. Anyone can kind of take this.
Okay, so trauma. I think that trauma is, well, according to Google, it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. But trauma and traumatic are two different things. I think that's something that's not talked about enough. What is traumatic to one individual may not be traumatic to another individual. And so even though you have different kinds of trauma, and the main kinds of trauma people talk about are acute trauma, which results from a single event, chronic trauma, which is ongoing. So that can be something like continued ongoing domestic violence, can also be racial trauma, continued racial trauma. You also have complex trauma, which looks different from, it's just a lot of different things and just a lot. So I feel like there are many different types of trauma, but the impact that it has on the individual will vary from person to person. So even though we may experience similar traumas, how we respond or react to those traumas, or how they impact our brain and our body, may vary from individual to individual. So we could have the same kind of, let's say like we're both experience, let's just say racial trauma. For one person, it may be more traumatic than it may be for another individual. And then another thing that I think is important to note about trauma is that you have trauma, some people say trauma with a big T and trauma with little t. And I feel like when people talk about big T trauma, it's some of those things that we think about, like childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, witnessing a murder, or being involved in some kind of really intense assault. But there are many, many, many things that are trauma and can be traumatic, and it's not just limited to big T trauma. Trauma is a thing that a lot of us experience just through living. So that's kind of how I would define trauma. And I also recognize that when I was talking, you cut out some batches, so I didn't talk about my actual work in relation to this. I just wanted to say this, this past year, I did a study with the help of my advisor on teachers' experiences in a trauma-informed urban high school. And it was a qualitative study. And so I got to do one-on-one interviews with a bunch of teachers who work within a predominantly Black urban high school to get their experiences, as well as discuss their own personal traumas that they were bringing into the work and how that was impacting how they show up in the work. So I did want to just put that out there because I recognize I did not say that in my introduction. So that's my definition of trauma, and then kind of what equips me to be here.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm glad you did add that. I think it's an important point for us to kind of pay attention to, right? As educators, that trauma of all types. And I'm so glad you broke that down for us. Thank you so much. And I understand that Brittany and Troy, you two may have a unique perspective on how trauma plays out in some of the work that you've done. Maybe you can tell us in your particular circles that you've done, how you showed up, how you work in circles, as something as a resource for those who are listening.
And just to clarify, are you speaking about how trauma shows up in a person, or how it shows up in a classroom? Just to kind of.
So we'll start with, let's go with how trauma shows up in the classroom first, and then I'll have Taylor kind of take us into how it manifests in our bodies, so people can pay attention to that.
I wanted to reference, I think that you kind of cut out, but I think you were talking about the work of Trajectory of Hope and how we have affinity circles. Did you mention that?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
sorry, my internet is like terrible, but.
It's okay. Really good.
Trajectory of Hope's tagline is working from the inside out. And I want to echo what Taylor, soon to be Dr. Stewart, well, actually probably another last name, but said, which is, I believe she was referencing self-care. So a lot of the work of Trajectory of Hope is working with educators. So our goal is to indirectly impact the students that they serve. So we're not doing work directly with students, but we're working with educators so that they can be well equipped, to then support the students. So with the work of working from the inside out and thinking about trauma, it's really about how do you start with yourself first? It's the self-work. And there's a text that also cites and kind of reaffirms what I'm speaking to by Sawyer and Hall, that references how we have to do the work as adults, because if we don't do the work as adults, we then get impacted also by the traumas that our students encounter. And as I was thinking through and preparing for this panel, I was thinking like Trajectory of Hope, we do working from the inside out. It's all about like, what's on the inside, let's bring it out to the forefront so we can address it and so you can be better able to serve the students. And when I was thinking about an analogy, because I love talking and speaking in analogies, I was thinking about, we have trauma, the small t, we have the traumatic event that happens, right? That such as a kid falls off their bike and they end up having a scratch on their knee. And all of us as adults, I would say 99.9% of people know what to do. Some peroxide, some alcohol, a Band-Aid, maybe just water, and say, dust yourself off, get back on the bike, go for it. You got this. The person who's supporting that kid is not going to be impacted by the fact that they fell off the bike, most likely. Now, some of us may feel a little like soft to the fact that like, oh, you're crying, that hurts my heart. But let's assume that they don't cry and they just scratch their knee. But then there's this other degree of it where there's traumatic events that have such a great impact, such as I thought of a fire. So if a child was in a burning building and you were the teacher, this is the classroom, the school building, and you were the teacher that was responsible for that child and you had to go inside that burning building to get that child. If you don't have the proper gear on to go into that building to not get severed, you're gonna get some type of, whether it's the inhalation of the smoke or you're gonna get some flames, something's gonna happen to you while you're trying to go in and support that kid to pull them out that building. So when I talk about self-care, when I talk about like how Trajectory of Hope is connected to this work, when we're thinking about you have to do the self-work, and I think about the self-work in that analogy as the protective gear. If you don't do the self-work, you don't have the proper protective gear on in order to go into that building, not be impacted by trying to save the kid. So we hear a lot about like the savior complex in education, right? We wanna save the kids, wanna make them better, because they just terrible kids in the hood and they need some people with degrees to come and just show them the way, right? Well, it's the same concept with trauma too. We can't go and save and support and say, oh, I'm gonna just adopt all my kids because they need my home and I have the best supportive system. Well, really, what have you dealt with your own traumas, right? So maybe you grew up in a 2-parent home, right? Maybe you went through high school, college, graduate school, all those things, and it seems and appears as if you've had no traumas, but really emphasizing what Taylor said, which I think is so essential. And I saw it in literature stated a little differently, where it's like the event and the impact. So the event is the small t, but the impact is the big T. So even though you may appear to think like, I don't have any trauma, like my life was good, but yet you've probably had some big T's that you need to pause. And part of the work of our affinity groups and our healing circles is, how do we pause? And I know we have a couple of folk who are on here who've been a part of our circles to be able to say, like, a lot of our questioning during that processing circle is to think about your experience when you were a student. And then with that experience as a student, how is it that you responded? Because when you're thinking about your student and you're getting frustrated with the fact that the student is not complying, for example, or not producing the work that you want them to produce, you have a different lens that you then are able to bring. So a lot of our work is really focused, not necessarily focused on trauma, but focused on lived experiences that impact the ways in which we show up as adults that then manifest how we support students.
And just to add on to what Troy is saying about what Trajectory of Hope is doing with the affinity groups, in addition to how trauma is represented in the classroom, I have one specific example of when I was a school social worker at the site that I worked at with Troya. I was first year as a school social worker at the site. Typical day, it was a Monday, so just came in ready to put out fires like every day. And we heard that there was a shooting or something that taken place the night before in the neighborhood, in the community, in the school community. And so as students were walking to school, there was yellow tape. And so they were walking to school past the yellow tape. And so we were not even on high alert, but just on alert to see if there was going to be anything that were to show up in the school day. But nothing happened. Everyone continued on their day. And it wasn't until towards the end of the school day that I got a call from the county social worker saying that there had been a shooting the night before of one of our students' parents. So one of our students' parents had been shot in the head by our student's adult brother. And so very traumatic situation where the student's brother shot their father in the head, and their father was in the hospital in a coma, and their adult brother was in jail. The student went through the whole school day as if nothing had happened. And I remember calling the student into my office, and we kind of worked and did some things, and I was present as they were interviewed with the social worker, and the social worker wanted to make sure that there was a safety plan so that the student could go home to safe family members that night. And the father survived. The father was in a coma, so the father survived, and all those things. But I wanted to really speak to how that trauma manifested for that child, where it appeared as if nothing had happened to this child. And the stable environment of school was actually a soothing and a coping strategy for this student. But also what I wanted to really speak to, which is the work that Trajectory of Hope does, which is really focusing on the educators. When myself and the administration came and presented what happened to the school staff, it was a huge situation where a lot of tears, a lot of emotions, a lot of trauma that was triggered for the staff members. Staff were crying, staff were trying to figure out how do we collect, create a meal train? What do we do? How do we support? And what Trajectory of Hope wants to do is work on the trauma, that vicarious trauma that was then inflicted on the educators, the trauma that educators experience every day just by going into the classroom. And I'm sure the educators know our partners, our spouses, our significant others, our friends, they hear about our vicarious trauma every day when we come out of the classroom, when we come home and we have that first 15 minutes to 30 minutes where we want to guess what happened? Or girl, let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you what this kid did. Or when a child is having an episode and maybe they destroy your classroom, teachers are also taking that in and feeling the way that the child is trying to express what's happening. And so Trajectory of Hope provides those safe spaces for educators to just process, what did you experience? And as it relates to how is trauma experienced in the classroom, you have your flight, fight, and freeze. You have your kids that, and Troy, I have experienced where they are tearing it up, or you have a child that is journaling self-harm behavior because maybe as a social worker, and I witnessed a child that was writing about self-harm because her stepfather was molesting her, which speaks to what Taylor was saying about the bigger traumas that people say. But then you also have the child that is just quiet because she's sad that her mom and dad had an argument the night before. And that was a trauma for this child.
And I just want to jump in, and actually, Ashley, you talked to this a lot about, I appreciate that Brittany brought up, trauma isn't always that fight response. And I think that's the one that tends to be focused on the most because maybe it's just the most visible. But Ashley has also spoken about how trauma in some ways is rewarded if it's quiet and it makes you more docile in your classroom, that schools actually applaud that and uplift that and continue to just kind of push that behavior along, and that type of trauma then gets missed. And so Ashley, I don't know if you have more you want to share about that, but I know that's a point you've made a lot of times.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely is one because it happened to myself personally. I was about maybe 7 years old and my mom got arrested. And, we see a lot of these images now coming out today. But at that time, people so mom getting arrested, they put her in the cop car and they put me and my sister in there. She's a year younger than me. They have us both in the back seat. They drop us off at my grandmother's house. And we have stairs that lead up to our porch and a door. They never opened the gate to walk up the stairs. So you have a 7-year-old and a 6-year-old, or maybe I was 8 and she was 7. Either way, it was around that time, sitting outside. No adults home because they're working. I've watched my mother scream and cry, saying, please don't do this in front of my children. Please don't cuff me in front of my children. Please don't do this. Screaming, right? And so you have me and my younger sister who are holding each other outside for hours until my grandmother called. And the next day, I go to school. right? And I go to school and I'm completely quiet. You know, a lot of people will tell you, oh, she was just a quiet kid. I don't know. I just kind of stopped talking. But in that moment, yeah, I would doodle, I would daydream, but no one would know that I'm not necessarily present in the classroom. No one would know that these things really impacted me. And it actually, like, there were some, like, development that was also being hindered that a lot of people didn't know about until I got tested as an adult, because I couldn't learn a language. Like, learning another language is extremely difficult for me. And I said, it cannot just be that I just can't get a language. Like, I don't understand. I'm practicing this day in and day out, and then come to find out I have a processing issue, right? And this was something that was not discovered because I was a good kid, because I was quiet, because I followed directions, because I did what I was told. And in that moment, I think about the fact that if I had gotten some form of therapy, if people, you know, took me to a school psychologist to work me through some of that trauma, how much further would I be? You know, and I critique. I mean, and we can talk about this, but I critique the school systems that have resource officers and not enough school psychologists, right? Like, let's have that conversation. And so at that time, you know, as a child, I was always just a good kid. You know, grades didn't really suffer until middle school. But all in all, you know, fine. And you got rewarded for it. And so, yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Brittany. And I think that just, it speaks volumes. And it's something that we ought to kind of pay attention to. And I kind of want to take this over to Taylor. Maybe you can give us more insight for those who want to know what are some of the signs that we can see or not see, or some of the things that we can pay attention to, what happens in our bodies. Because I think about how I have migraines all the time growing up, right? And all those things. So what are some of the signs, and what are some of the things our students are going to be feeling in their bodies, especially since you talked about vicarious trauma, right? With what they're seeing on the news all the time, and all the conversations probably going on right now, what they're seeing on their Instagrams and their Facebooks, their social medias. What are some of the signs that manifest in our bodies as human beings in general, that trauma's there?
Yeah. I also just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story and your experiences. Yeah, it's very, yeah, resonates very heavily. So I think in terms of the body, the way that trauma impacts the body, I think that Brittany really touched upon it when she said, you know, we have fight, flight, and freeze, right? And a lot of times in response to trauma or any kind of really intense stressor, the body's going to go into either fight, flight, or freeze modes. That can look like hyperarousal, it can look like hypoarousal, constriction, tension, tightness, it can look like dissociation, depending on what parts of the nervous system are activated. So if the sympathetic nervous system's activated, that's more of your fight or flight kind of thing. So you can experience there racing thoughts, increased heart rate, more like muscular tension, shallow breathing. A lot of, when you're talking about some of the executive functioning difficulties, you can have difficulty articulating your words, difficulty paying attention, things like that. And you can also see a lot of dysregulation. So within students, that can look like abrupt changes of behavior. You know, someone can be, you know, typically calmer and just off and angry and going off the handles. And it's not because necessarily they just want to act out. It's how they're responding to a trauma that they've experienced or some kind of stressor in their life. On the other hand, you have the people who do kind of, like what you were saying, Ashley, which is, I feel like it can kind of go between flight and more of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more of the relaxation response. So a lot of times you hear people saying, okay, like you may be a little dysregulated, maybe you're feeling very tight, maybe you're getting migraines, maybe you are acting out, maybe you're talking back. Perhaps we should just bring in some breathing, some grounding, some different strategies to kind of get you more regulated. And that's kind of to activate that parasympathetic nervous system or that relaxation response, which can kind of slow down your heartbeat some, give you deeper diaphragmatic breathing. But also there's another side of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is where the freeze takes place. And that can be when everything is completely almost like shuts down. And that can lead to immobilization, that can lead to shock, it can lead to not being as present. And then you have dissociation when your students are just checked out. And it doesn't really matter what you're saying, it's just going over their heads. And it can be easy for a teacher who doesn't understand how trauma impacts the body to take that as a conduct issue, or why aren't you paying attention in class, or what's wrong with you. And I think that someone mentioned it earlier, but a lot of times teachers are not informed as to what trauma-sensitive pedagogy actually looks like. So in the study that I did last year, even though 80% of the teachers said that they had learned about how trauma impacts the brain and how it might show up in their students, literally none of them had training in trauma-sensitive pedagogical practice. So even though they were in this school that prided itself on being trauma-informed, they weren't actually taught how to work with these students who are experiencing trauma. And the things that they learned through experience and years of teaching, and not because someone came to them and said, okay, this is what the student may be experiencing. And as a teacher and an educator, these are ways that you can perhaps reach that student more, or help that student kind of regulate more so that they can function better. Because the trauma really can impact our neural circuitry. You know, trauma, PTSD, we talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that impacts your hippocampus, it impacts your amygdala, it impacts the prefrontal cortex, you know, it impacts the neurodevelopment, you know, and these are things that students do need support with. And a lot of times that is through someone like Troy, going to the school psychologist, or going to the school social worker, or going to whatever mental health providers that are available to students in their schools. And there's a need for more of that for students and teachers. But the reality and the data shows that most often teachers are first responders for students who've experienced trauma, because they're encountering these students on a day-to-day basis, right? And 80% of the mental health care that students receive occurs within the school. So yeah, so trauma can manifest itself in many, many different ways. And I think that it's very important for teachers not only to understand how it can manifest, but what to do when they see it manifesting in front of them. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess that leads me to this thought, because we're talking about trauma, we're talking about some experiences and how it happens in the classroom. What is something practical that educators can do today, right? Administrators, counselors can do today to be more trauma informed, right? These things happen in the classroom. What is something that they can do to begin to be more trauma informed and have these restorative practices happen in their classrooms? I'll leave that open to anyone.
I wanted to offer a text that I think could be helpful. I teach a classroom management course, and I take excerpts from this particular book because of the practicality, and just to echo some of what Taylor was saying in regards to the impact of the brain, just to kind of focus on that for a second. There's a text called Fostering Resilient Learners, Creating Strategies for Creating Trauma-Sensitive Classrooms. It's a very practical text. I use a couple of chapters, as I mentioned, and there's something that was cited by a psychiatry professor from UCLA by the name of Dr. Dan Siegel. And he talks about how it impacts the brain, and the analogy and the way in which he talks about it, I think, is a practical way in which teachers can kind of take in to think through how they can support students. And he talks about the upstairs and the downstairs brain. And this is echoing what Taylor is saying, I'm just framing it differently. And what Dr. Siegel is speaking to is that the downstairs brain is that limbic system, which constitutes the whole arousal, emotions, the fight, flight, or freeze. And how oftentimes when incidents happen, those are activated. So fight, fight, or freeze, one of those things are going to be present, and the behaviors may vary in what they look like for the fight, fight, or freeze, but that is what is activated. And then there's the upstairs brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that supports in making decisions and being rational and reasoning appropriately. And what he suggests in the text is that if teachers, one, first come to learn their own like moments in which trigger their flight, fight, or freeze, and how they're able to transition from that moment of being activated in their downstairs brain to then kind of transitioning to the upstairs brain. One, knowing themselves. So again, I think all of my stance is about like self, right? But also understanding that the goal is that we're not going to try to take away the triggers. Like sometimes you can't, like certain things are just gonna activate the flight, fight, or freeze in that limbic system. But the goal is that how can we, as teachers, educators I'll speak to because I'm not a teacher, but how can we as educators support students in being able to quickly transition from the flight, fight, or freeze, the activation of the downstairs brain, to then activate the upstairs brain, which is their prefrontal cortex. So there are lots of ways in which that can happen, right? But one of the key pieces, which I think is something that oftentimes, and I emphasize it so much in my course that I teach, is you have to know your students. Because even though the same trauma can happen, like let's say we have siblings who are twins, let's use that example, and they both experience and witness the same thing, but they're two different individuals, even though they may be identical twins. And how in which things, getting to know them is going to be helpful to know, like, what is the strategy I'm going to use to support them in transition from that downstairs brain moment to getting them to that upstairs brain moment? Could it be that I allow them to go to the comfort zone, maybe you call it in your classroom, or the quiet space? Could it be that you allow them to take out a book to read? It could range. So it's really difficult to provide like a laundry list of like, do this, and this, because it's no one antidote for any one student, because you really have to know, like, relationships are key to really being able to do any type of work. If you want to be a social justice educator, culturally responsive educator, trauma-informed educator, you must know your students. So, but I thought that the Dan Siegel analogy is a great one. And the students always tell me like, thank you so much for this reading. It's so great, because it just helps make it real practical of like, oh wait, like downstairs is working. And in the text, it is an example of a teacher rolling this out to her students, and the students taking and gravitating to this idea of like them using the language themselves and saying like, yes, my downstairs brain is activated right now, and I'm working to engage my upstairs brain. And just that language in and of itself, and being able to build that within your classroom environment and space to know, like, I'm speaking to what's happening, I'm naming it, I'm calling it what it is, and I'm working to get to the next place, whether that's journaling, quiet space, walk, water, etc. So I wanted to share that.
And building off of what Troy said, and kind of taking some of the things from what she was saying, as a social worker, as a clinician, in your social work program, if you're an MFT, in your MFT program, you are highly encouraged to get a therapist. If you're going to do the work, you have to get a therapist. And I'm a mental health professional, so I have to encourage, I think that some of the work of being able to recognize trauma and doing the work of kind of de-escalating trauma in your classroom is you have to first understand it at its core within yourself. The work the Trajectory of Hope does is to support the whole adult, and you have to be whole yourself to be able to then support children, students becoming whole. But then now that I'm in the classroom, currently in the classroom as a teacher, I've become overwhelmed. I'm like, okay, culturally responsive pedagogy, got it. Okay, culturally sustaining pedagogy, okay. Anti-racist educator, got it. Kendi, okay. Zoom, Nearpod, it's overwhelming. I was in an all-day training today. I wanted to like literally like faint. It's so much. It's overwhelming, and I'm like, what do I tackle first? Okay, trauma-sensitive classrooms. Like, how do I do it all? How do I be the best? Because I am like, check the box of like, how do I do it right? Just tell me what I need to do right, because that's what I want to do. I want to get the A+. But there isn't no simple answer. And I was talking to our principal, Dr. Brandy Odom Lucas, and she quoted Dr. Asa Hillard to me when I was asking her. I was like, so Brandy, like, what do I do? How do I approach all of this? And so to me, like, Troy and Taylor have already given amazing examples of what you can do in the classroom. But for me, what grounded me and I was able to be centered with is Dr. Asa Hillard said, the first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. And I was like, oh, okay, I can do that. So I think for me, that's a very practical way of how to implement trauma-informed practices, is first just start with treating students as human beings, and second, love them.
And to just piggyback off of what all of you are saying, I think a lot of teachers who are implementing these strategies then get pushback that they're being too lenient. So strategies like letting a student go to the bathroom or take a walk, get a drink of water, sit in the cool down corner and relax, or have a few minutes of meditation, whatever it is, the strategies that you wind up coming up with for each particular student, like you said, Troya, really making sure that you know that child, in my experience, it was always kind of a partnership of what are your 3 go-to strategies that we came up with together out of a larger bank. But can any of you speak to that pushback that there is, and explain why on kind of the brain-based level, this isn't being like letting kids get away with things. This isn't giving them free rein, but this is actually fundamental to their learning in the classroom, and just kind of how that plays out. Because I think a lot of teachers are afraid to implement these interventions because they're afraid that it's seen as letting students walk all over or letting them do whatever they want.
Yeah, I feel like it's so interesting because I feel like a lot of what Brittany, you and Troya said is kind of speaking to this. In the study that I did, something that was really interesting that came up was that several teachers said, so the administration wants me to be like more sensitive. And then when I start being more sensitive or like bring up these issues to the administrator to say, oh, well, you're not a therapist. Why are you saying that? And so it's like, you're asking me to do these things, and when I'm doing them, I'm getting negative feedback saying I shouldn't be doing them. And then on the other hand, there were teachers who were saying, we used to not be as sensitive in our approach, but now we are so sensitive and there's no disciplinary consequences. So like, what do we do there? And I think that it goes back to what Troya said about how we have to do the self-work. Because there's a reason why we feel that providing actual trauma-sensitive pedagogy is not disciplinary enough or not this enough. I think that goes into the systems thing where we were talking about at the end of the panel, where certain kinds of behavior are rewarded and certain kinds of behavior are not. The reality is that we are all human, and when we come from a place of respecting the humanity of each of these students and a place of love, as Brittany was saying, like, I feel like it's easier when you approach it from that lens rather than I want this student to act in this way. I think that the way that teachers and systems and schools view this kind of educational practice won't be seen as not disciplinary enough, or there's too much misconduct. But I also think that there is a line to find between, I don't think that providing trauma-sensitive educational practices is the same thing as not having discipline or not holding students accountable. So something that really stood out to me in the research that I did was half of my sample talked about how it's important for them in building relationships with their students. And this was a student population that had a very high percentage of students who experienced trauma. A huge part of their building the really tight, safe, and trusting relationship was holding students accountable to certain things and certain behaviors. And they would talk about how there were students who came back and would just thank you for calling that out. Thank you for talking with me after class. Thank you for letting me step outside and taking a walk with me, because nobody else holds me accountable, And I think that for those students, that accountability actually helped them do better, because that teacher-student relationship was modeling for them what a healthy relationship can look like. So I don't really know what the answer is as far as, schools sometimes viewing, or individual teachers or administrators viewing being more trauma sensitive as not being disciplined enough. I think that's really because of how we've come to see students and educational systems as having to be a certain way, and that means successful. Whereas actually you can be the most successful when you're the most full and the most healed. And like Troy was saying, that starts within ourselves, and then us, inspiring that and cultivating that within our students and our clients. So I think that there's a need for a shift. And thankfully, I think that we're having more of these conversations, and hopefully those shifts can really begin happening like you're doing, Troy and Brittany, and you're, you know, through the Trajectory of Hope, like you all are doing through this institute. But I think that it just takes time.
Absolutely, it all takes time, and it also requires administrators, and I say administrators more specifically, to recognize colonized practices, right? Like, in order for trauma-informed work to take place, we have to decolonize our schools in a way that allows this environment to be cultivated for our students, our teachers, our staff, because honestly, there's this concept in our minds that a student is learning when they're docile, when they're, you know, respectful, right? It's that civilized language. They're not civilized. You have to have this, that, and the third. And that in and of itself is based in racist practices, right? And so to be trauma informed is to do that anti-racist work. But a lot of us are afraid to actually call that out for what it is, because, you know, that good, bad binary says, oh, I can't be racist. Like, that's just, we don't do those things. I'm a great person. I'm a good person, right? And so debunking the myth that we, like, education as a system has its own story. And so we have to understand that we are living within this racist story of education. And therefore, these symptoms of it are actually coming to bear at several points within schools. And one of them just so happens to be discipline, right? Because if you don't fit the mold of what is whiteness and white-centered expectations of behavior, then therefore you are deviant. And especially if you are a Black, Indigenous, person of color, if you have a disability, if you have a learning disability, that all of that, if you're not silenced and marginalized, then you are hyper visible and centered as the issue, right? And so trauma informed, you just taking the step to say, I'm going to make sure that every child in my classroom can thrive. That's you taking a moment to say, listen, I'm pushing back against the system that is like working against my student, right? And so how does this actually like play out? I probably didn't get teaching, honestly, until my 5th year. I don't think I got it down as an art or nothing. You know, that was real, Brittany. When I heard the list of the things I was supposed to keep track of and grades, and it was like, I didn't get this thing for real until my last year of teaching, right? And the reason why I got it was because I took time to get to know the students. And you're absolutely right. That's the beginning. That's the start. That's the first step. And what I would do is have a journaling activity almost every class, because when they came in, I had, again, another part of having a trauma-informed space is an accountable space that is structured for continuity, right? Like, students can expect this when they come into your room because that structure is familiar. So every time my students come to my classroom, they would have some form of a practice, right, of self-reflection. And I used emojis because, I was that corny teacher. I love emojis. And my kids, got used to it. But I would put emojis on the board, and they stayed there all year. And I said, in those moments where they were paying attention to what was going on inside them and they're reacting, they would take the time and say, look, I'm this emoji. Can I write about it today? And at first, I started that process of them doing it, right, where I would say, here's a journal. We're going to reflect on which emoji you're feeling today and tell me why. And then I get to know them through their journals and having our, one-on-one workshops, because I was teaching English language arts. But when they started to do it themselves, and then I would begin to model for them, right? There would be days where, again, I'm the educator who is taking on all these things, these life things. I'm not a perfect human being. So I would come into the classroom and say, this is my emoji today. Right? I respect you when you're here in this space. We have conversations about how I can support you. Here's how you can support, because I cannot show up my best if we're not working together. Have those honest, model conversations so that students can do that themselves, right? And I think that a lot of times we feel like we're not doing our jobs as educators if we're honest with students, that we have to put on this perfection, this, and me personally, I don't, perfection just doesn't exist, right? It's not a model for me. that I can aspire to, nor have my students to aspire to. And so in that moment, I think it's also about modeling as educators. That's the strategy, right? Being able to communicate when you can what's going on for students to be mindful of and to pay attention. That's just, one tool that we can also use beside, including taking a break, having a cool down corner, and doing all those things. And so I want to thank you all for this conversation. It has been really fruitful. I want to have some time for questions. I see some questions are in the chat, and there are other, if you have other questions, please feel free to write in the chat to ask your questions. And then Brittany Spatz, let me know if I miss any of these. So I'll start in our questions chat. So what readings would you recommend for a beginner teacher trying to understand trauma-informed instruction? And so I'll say it again. What readings would you recommend for a beginner teacher trying to understand trauma-informed instruction? Oh, especially racial trauma. Hopefully
Immediately what came to mind for myself was a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGruy. And it speaks about the historical trauma that specifically the African American community experienced, or the Black community within the US experience, and the manifestations physically in the bodies that is embodied in the Black community because of slavery. That is not discussed heavily, that is minimized. And I think that it kind of speaks to what you were speaking about, Ashley, as the perpetuation of the colonial perspective within education. That's immediately off top, and I can just leave it at that. There's a couple more I'm thinking of, but that one for sure, immediately.
Yeah, I also have one. It's actually sitting here because I've been doing reading up on this a little bit. Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. As you can see, I'm old school, so there are plenty of notes that you can pull from that as well. I don't know if Taylor or Brittany or Troy, do you have anything that you lean on or that you've read?
Specifically about regarding racial trauma, this isn't a book that's necessarily written for teachers, but there are a few chapters in the book that speak specifically to school systems and education and educators. There's this book called Using Race and Culture in Counseling and Psychotherapy. And it's written by Janet Helms and Imelda Cook. And they talk a lot about how race and culture kind of shows up and influences how individuals show up in different spaces, including educational spaces. And I think that can be, especially in regards to racial trauma, I think it can be something that's helpful looking at those couple of chapters just to better understand it. There's also the Racial Trauma Toolkit, which is, you can go to Boston College's website, the Institution for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture. A group of psychologists put that together, and it kind of takes you through different strategies that you can use. And you can use them with yourself, like the self-work that Troy was talking about, but you can also use them with your students and helping them kind of developing their own toolkit for really, unfortunately, having to cope with racial trauma. So those are two resources that I would recommend.
We have another question here, which I think Brittany and Troy might be able to help us out with. She says, I am an elementary school counselor, and I'm for changing the system in our school. I came out of grad school with my fist high, ready to fight the system to find out that not everyone is on the same page. I don't have a classroom, so when I do interventions with students, the teachers often think I'm being lenient, but I'm noticing what the kids need, and it's not punishment. I guess what is something that they can do to begin changing some of this culture in their school?
Well, I think what comes to mind first is the fact that we have to fully understand the systems that we work within. And actually, you already spoke to that. And there was an article by Gorski, I can't think of his first, Paul Gorski, that talks about, his article talks about equity detours, but the article comes to mind because what he's pushing for is that ultimately in schools that say they're doing equity work, which oftentimes some way, somehow includes social emotional learning, trauma, it all is like wrapped up into one. They oftentimes, the rule is that the label of equity work is happening, but what's actually happening is that there's those that really are doing the work, and then there's like the label of the PDs that everyone goes to. And the unfortunate thing is that in most of our schools, whether you're in charter, private, public, really doesn't matter which particular context, the rule is that you're gonna most likely be the exception if you're coming in with your fist in the air wanting to make radical change. And unfortunately, as an intervention support, you're not gonna be able to make the change at the level that you want to so that it trickles down and where you're not the only one, and then being looked at and evaluated in a way as if like you're doing something wrong versus actually you're doing something that's beneficial for students. And in Gorski's article, he talks about that, where it's like teachers are looking at you as a teacher who was doing something that's counter when actually you're doing the thing that is necessary to really push forth what's needed for students. So I think that my advice in response to this question would be to continue to do the work you're doing, because you know at the center you're there for the student, not for being well liked by the teacher that the classroom the student is coming from. And it's radical to do it, but I think that it's important to do it. And I think of Dr. Bettina Love and the idea that that we have to be radical in our work and as educators. And if we really want to support change, that it means being radical, and in small ways or in large ways, whatever fits your comfort zone. We all have lanes, right? So I think that there's no just one answer of like, do this and this is going to promote the change that we need to see in the world in education, but it's really just staying in your lane. You're intervention support. You do the work that you need to do with those students. You create those relationships that you need to create with your students to then get them to learn, to progress in ways that are going to benefit them in the long run.
And to add on to that, in the midst of COVID, this necessarily isn't specifically something that can take place in the lunchroom, but I was immediately thinking of the lunchroom. And so yes, centering always the relationships with the child and making those impacts, because those have life-lasting impacts on the child's longevity and just what's gonna happen with the child 10, 5, 15 years later. But in that lunchroom, there is some very racist, colonial, non-loving language that takes place. And just with one conversation, it can definitely drastically shift the trajectory of your colleague. Because then if you are building that relationship, building that rapport, having difficult conversations, then maybe a light bulb changes and sparks, and then that shifts the whole outcome for all of the students that that educator has contact with. And then that can then trickle on to more and more. So additionally, like I think in the lunchroom, and then I guess in the midst of COVID, maybe it's in the chat and it's speaking up and typing things in the chat as soon as something that sounds racist, that sounds insensitive, that sounds just not right. Like, speak your truth. That speaks volumes.
Yeah, thank you both for that. Really appreciate that. We are going to have to wrap up soon, but I have to get to this question. It is so important, and I think it's something that weighs on everyone's mind right now, so they're going to want this answer. Do you have any particular ways that educators should look out for trauma to show up in online classroom spaces this fall? And any specific ways to show love to students and help them into their upstairs brain? There's a lot of things I think going around for everyone when it comes to online instruction. So how can we be mindful of this?
I feel like, yes, this is so relevant, and I feel like it's something that we're all learning together at the same time. Something that I know that we're doing. So I work as an academic advisor for students in addition to the mental health counseling work that I do. So something that we've been talking about in the more not the mental health counseling side, but my other job is more frequent check-ins, individual one-on-one check-ins. So typically where we would do, you know, maybe like 3 check-ins, 3 to 4 check-ins. Now it's like, okay, well, actually, can you like double or triple that, even if they're really short, but just that one-to-one, like, hey, like this is your advisor. I'm just reaching out to schedule just a quick check-in to see how you're doing. Because the reality is that depending on what the rules are for your online space, some spaces require people to see your face, other spaces do not. There's no real way for us to know what's going on with our students unless we're having those frequent and regular conversations. So I feel like that's one thing. Another thing that I'm thinking about, because I do college mental health counseling, and I'm very curious as to see like what it's going to be like as far as demand this semester. But I definitely think whatever school system or education system you're in, figuring out what those supports are regarding social workers, psychologists, therapists, because I think that we may need a tighter wraparound during this time, especially because we can't see the students, and a lot of them are environments that may not be conducive for learning and may also be traumatic environments for them. So I think a lot more checking in is one thing.
I would just kind of add on to what Taylor was saying. Last semester when we were in Zoom, at one point I had a classroom of 40 students and I broke them into 40 different individual groups, and I would kind of slide in and check in with them. That was one of the things that kind of showed up for me, and when I was able to engage them to find out what was going on. I think also as soon as you hear what's going on, like one of our students was moving, just finding spaces to be able to build relationships. I was still teaching when the videos of Ahmaud Arbery started showing, and I made sure to provide space. I also start my classrooms with warm-ups, Ashley, and so I made sure to provide that space to bring what's going on in the classroom, outside of the classroom, into the classroom, and then providing that space, whether it's through you want to talk, whether it's through you want to write about it. I had students that never engaged in writing or speaking that chose to write. I'm angry, I'm scared. And then also what I found was interesting is my most gregarious, most vocal Black students chose to not say a word during that class. So just providing those spaces, I think, is we have as an opportunity as teachers or as educators. And then office hours. I provided office hours. Troya told me about what she was doing with colleagues, work bursts. Mm-hmm. So when I was working on stuff for Trajectory of Hope, I would offer students to kind of join me offline on a different day that we didn't have class for them to do their work. And so they're on Zoom and I'm working on my stuff and they're working on their stuff, but that's also kind of building that rapport and that relationship in the midst of COVID.
Yeah, and I would just add, the Fostering Resilient Learners text kind of references is that sometimes we get, as humans, I think, caught up in the event, and the event gets us so distracted, and then that's when we get so consumed of like, oh my gosh, the student lives in a house with 20 people, and you know we're so focused there. And I would say, as you know, an educator who's getting ready to re-enter the fall with this new platform, with understanding the stressors that are happening in just the world, let alone whatever's happening in one of our students' homes, is to not try your best to not get lost in the event or what could be happening, but really focus on what do you see that's different? What do you see that seems to be a little off from that student? And if you notice anything that seems to be a little off, whether it's they're quieter, whether it's they're more withdrawn, whether they are seeming to be a bit more hyper, like responding in ways that seem like that are not accustomed to what's expected in school, and before maybe the previous school year that wasn't an issue, I would take attention to that, and then figure out what options can you offer within the Zoom platform to allow for them to have that, that time to get to that upstairs brain. So what does that mean? That you're gonna send a singular chat to that student to say like, hey, if you need to hop off real quick, please by all means go hop off and then come back in about 10 minutes. Or is it that you're gonna send chats to every single student and your chat is the same thing, but you're doing individual chats so that every student feels that they are valued in that space? Is it that you're gonna do a mood meter and it's a color and everybody puts in the chat the color that they are that day? So like, to me, it's like, I think instead of getting caught up, which I think is a human thing for us to get caught up in the event that takes place, that we just really take heed to and being aware of what's happening with our students based on what we can see, and then making sure that we have a menu of options that we've come up with. Google is a great resource, as we all know, but things that we can come up with that we can replicate in the Zoom platform or just the online platform to provide opportunity and space. If it means no camera on and you being able to be flexible, I like that word much better than lenient, right? Being flexible with the fact that this is also universal design for learning. How do we allow learning to take place in ways that don't only have to be, I look at you, you're attending to me because your eyes are fixed on the screen. And it's that actually I need the screen off so that I really can focus, because it's distracting to see all the faces, right? So I think just coming up with, start off with maybe three options that you're saying. If I notice students seem to be disengaged, I'm not gonna call it trauma, because that could be dangerous too, right? But I'm gonna say, the student may need something different. Let me check in on them and say like, hey, do you wanna do this, or this? Is it of interest to you? Assuming that this is the first 2 weeks and you don't know the student yet, you're still trying to get to know them, right? So I think just not getting caught up with the event and really being able to focus on how can I respond and what are some ways that I've come up with as an educator to offer them ways of coping with whatever they could be experiencing.
Thank you so much. We have come to time. It is almost 8:30. We literally have a minute. So I'm getting ready to run through a whole bunch of things in a minute. Bear with me. Number one, we want to thank each and every person here tonight, not just our panelists, but those of you who have participated, who have come to witness this. Many of you have said, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are a startup. This is just the beginning of our work. And we want to be able to gift our panelists with something that is an important part of anti-racist work, right? We want to stop having Black, Indigenous persons of color to share not only their traumas and their work and the things that they do, parts of themselves, but also their expertise, and not be able to give them something. So if you go to our website, if you want to donate to these beautiful minds that have just imparted their wisdom to us tonight, please make sure to go to our website and go ahead and donate to them and their work. We also have events coming up. We have several coming up, but next week you can actually talk to someone who is an educator, was an educator, is a math supervisor in STEM, Jalila, I'm not sure if she's doctor yet, Jalila Frazier, working on doing some work here in New Jersey with East Orange, I think, public school. So keep that in mind. Sign up for our newsletter. Okay, we got a lot going on. We give you tips every week. We write these different things in our newsletter, give you resources. So sign up for our newsletter on our website. Also, if you want to get more information. I'm sorry if we cannot get your questions. Check us out on social media, Instagram, Anti-Racist Institute, Facebook, the Institute for Anti-Racist Education. Where can they connect with all of you if they wanted to connect with Trajectory of Hope, or they wanted to follow your work, Taylor? 2 seconds, sorry.
On Instagram, we're at trajectory_hope_, and we have a website, trajectoryofhope.org.
Thank you.
And for me, you can follow me on Instagram at Taylor Talks Healing. You can also contact me through Boston College. If you look up my name, Taylor Stewart, Boston College, my information will come up.
All right, thank you all so much again for joining us. We are just so excited, and we are just truly blessed to have just taken a moment to share with each and every one of you. We wish you well. Have a great one.
Thank you. Bye.